So just before we get started, it's very informal. This is Worldcon is one thing. We're just going to hang out with Steve and we're going to ask him some questions. We're going to go through a list of stuff here. We're going to see what Stephen has to say. At the end of it, we'll put it to you guys. You guys have any questions, we'll put it to him. When it's all over and done with, we're going to do some signings, then we're going to go upstairs and we're going to drink some pints. That, everybody happy? Yeah? Alright. We'll keep it very sociable, okay? So first things first, where did this come from? And what's wrong with you?
That will take more than one night. Let's see. Where did this come from? It came from gaming. Myself and Ian C. Eslamont were both archaeologists, and we met on a date. And I knew nothing about D&D, but he did. He'd spent most of his university playing D&D instead of going to class. And but he talked me into it. And the first game I ever played was on the site. So we were in a camp on the side of a lake, and unfortunately, we smoked way too much dope, so the game was a complete disaster. And then it took I guess about another half a year before Cam ended up joining me in Victoria when I was taking a writers program, and we shared a flat, so we started gaming. And both being archaeologists, both being anthropologists, we wanted to make sure that our fantasy world was internally consistent in terms of cultural evolution, civilizations, all that kind of thing. And so that's what the gaming basically involved. And there was times that we gamed entire sessions. How many people here play role-playing games? All right, you all know. We would play an entire session, so it would be 6 hours where nobody pulled a sword, nobody cast a spell. It was nothing but conversation. And that conversation is what created the characters like Whiskey Jack and Cotillion and Kellenbed and all of these people. And so when it finally came time to actually write the stories, they'd been alive in our heads for years. And I think that came out onto the page. But actually in some ways to our detriment, because it left everybody lost. We knew them, but nobody else did.
So what I've got a bunch of questions here that people put up on the Malazan Empire page on Facebook, and I've taken a few of them, and I've taken a few from other sources as well, so I'm going to hit you with a couple of these and you burn through them as quick as you can.
Just ask me, don't hit me.
Well, so what sort of emotional toll does writing a sequence like the Chain of Dogs take? Do you have a self-care routine afterwards? Like, did you cry writing it?
That's a great question.
Because I cried. I didn't write it.
Yeah. Yeah. What kind of toll? It was extraordinary. It took 8 years to find the publisher for the first one. So it was, I'd almost thought that, I almost began to believe the editors who were turning the books down. Basically saying there's no audience out there for this, and too complicated, too many characters. And so I ended up moving to the UK, moving to England, because I thought actually that audience, the UK, Great Britain, whatever, is going to be more sophisticated than the American audience, because the American publishers were all turning this down. And I had a 5-year plan to find an agent and get the first book published. And I managed that in 3 years. So, and it took us another 3 years after that to finally twist the arms of a publisher in the US. And to this day, my biggest royalty checks come from the States. So if there are any beginning writers out there and editors turn you down, fuck them. They don't know shit. They don't know shit. So it was 11 years from the last revision of Gardens to the completion of The Crippled God. And I was living in Falmouth in Cornwall when I finished. I was writing in a Cafe Nero. And looked out the window with the last lines delivered on the screen. And it was like this immense weight just lifted off my shoulders that I didn't know was there. And there were times, I mean, I'll probably tell this story at some point, but between the writing of book 9 and 10, I did some archaeology in Mongolia that nearly killed me. And I got very sick. Goat's head soup, the goat's head lying on the ground for 3 days before it showed up in the soup. And I remember thinking, I was sitting on the bus going through northern Mongolia back to Ulaanbaatar, a 10-hour bus trip. And I was thinking, if I die now, because I've been bit by a spider as well, it just goes on and on. It's the stupidest thing. If I die now, between book 9 and 10, wherever my gravestone is, it's going to be annually pissed now. And so I was desperate to get back and to finish the book. And that's what I did in Cornwall. And got it done. And it was just, in terms of sort of handling the aftermath, I don't know if I handled it well. I thought, okay, I'll take a bit of a break. You know, I've been writing, I wrote what, 3.2 million words in 11 years plus. And so, okay, I'll take a break. I took the break for 3 days. And then I started on the next one. So, anyways.
Have you ever reread any of your books? And are there
Fuck
any
no.
characters?
They're too long.
Yeah. Are there any characters that you wish you chose a different fate for?
No.
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 They were all nailed.
Yeah. Yeah. I knew where they were
Literally
going or not going. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So tell me this: since word of mouth is such a large
Oh
factor.
wait a minute! No, I take that back. Actually.
Oh yeah. Who?
The character of Trell Sengar.
Yes.
Yeah.
That made me cry.
I didn't know where that was going until about 20 pages before I got there. So yes. Anyways, go
So
on.
since word of mouth is such a large factor in people finding this series, do you think the internet has helped massively?
Yeah. But it's changed the relationship between the writer and the audience. And I think a lot of writers, at least of my generation, were initially quite resistant. They like that aloofness. They like to stay away from and not be necessarily in contact with the fans of their books. And I realized early on that that's ridiculous. You want to be in contact. You want to actually find out what they're thinking. And so I sort of embraced that very quickly.
Is there still a Malazan encyclopedia planned?
Of course it's planned.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's planned like Brexit is planned.
There's been no movement. It's going to be this size.
Yeah, well, Cam's a lot better at archiving his material than I am.
Yeah.
And I actually got somebody to come in and archive that stuff. And that's sort of the beginning of putting it all together for an encyclopedia.
Okay. So you've said before that compassion is the main theme
Yes.
of the Malazan series. Will the theme differ in the coming trilogy, or are you going to stay in that vein?
Which coming through in trilogy?
Oh,
I've got two.
You've
right?
got two. You've got
Yeah.
one you didn't finish.
Yeah. All right, I know. It's coming. Don't worry.
So if you're going to approach someone like Karsa,
Like who?
like Karsa Arlong, are you going to come at him from a
Karsa.
compassionate point of view, or
Yeah.
are you going to go full Conan?
No, I won't go full Conan.
No?
No, I've already warned people that the Karsa trilogy, the first book, doesn't even have Karsa in it.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Oh, don't go off. The thing with Karsa is there's a legacy. There's a huge legacy. He's left wreckage in his wake, and that needs to be explored before I can actually get to Karsa again.
Okay. Do you see an end to this world? Do you think it could spiderweb infinitely if you wanted it to, or do you think it should have an absolute definite end?
Say no.
Well, that's a good question. I'm signed to do 3 more Bocaling and Coral Brooch novellas. And then I've got the third book in the Carcanis trilogy to finish, which is going to be massive.
Okay.
And then I've got the Karsa trilogy, which is basically, it's more along the lines of Eslavon's latest books, because it will be one giant novel I split into 3.
Okay.
And then after that, I'm certainly not signed for anything, and I don't know, because the last novel I've written was a science fiction novel, and I do want to follow up on that as well. But I'm getting old, guys.
You're not allowed.
You're not allowed to get old.
Well,
So you said one of your biggest inspirations for writing this series was Stephen Donaldson's Chronicles of
Yes.
Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. It's the biggest name ever. It's shocking. Have you ever met Stephen?
Sorry,
Have you ever
met
met
him.
Steve?
We've become very good friends.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Tell
much
me
to my
this.
amazement. Yes.
This is one thing since I start reading these books, and this is a very much a sidetracky thing. Would you like to write something in that universe?
In Donaldson's universe?
Yeah.
No.
No, you just leave him be.
Yeah.
There's one thing. There's just connections, not necessarily in theme, but in feel between the two series, and I always felt that. There's certain series of books that I'd love to see like an outsider's perspective of. I'd love to see somebody not live in his brain write that world, if you get me. And I think you are one of the people I would love to see attempt to write something in that.
Well, in terms of influence, my major influences within fantasy was basically Glenn Cook and Stephen Donaldson. And Donaldson came first. But so my writing style is a blending of those two. And Steve's, I've gone back and reread the first 6 books.
Yeah.
And I've read the completion of Thomas Covenant series. And those first 3 books, they are the most Latinate style you could imagine in terms of writing. And I know I remember reading them and having a dictionary at hand because I needed it.
Yes.
And that slipped into a lot of the style of my writing. But what I loved with Glenn Cook was the terseness and the brevity of his writing, and the fact that it was on boots on the ground soldiers. And
Very
so
much.
it's kind of pulling in, stylistically, you pull in the high fantasy and the high language of Donaldson and drag it in, and drag it through the dirt, basically. Yeah.
So we've read rumours about TV shows and movies and all sorts of variations on your work. Is there, aside from anything that may have happened or been cancelled in the past,
Yeah, I got cancelled. Yeah.
would you like to see it on the screen or on video?
We got as close as you can get, but at the same time, we dodged a bullet. And I'll explain this story.
Is this the Weinstein story?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
You know this story.
Yeah.
Well, if you all know this story, then
This
I'll
is good.
explain it.
Strap yourselves in.
All right, we had signed a contract with a major producer, and we were waiting on the option check to be signed by that producer. It sat on his desk for about 6 months, and then everything was canceled. And that was Harvey Weinstein, and that was right before the shit hit the fan, and the Weinstein Group went under. Had we sold the rights, we would still be in a legal nightmare now, because that property then would have been picked up by the nearest debt collector you could think of, and then we would have been screwed, because the contract, you have to bear in mind that when you sell something like 1 book or 3 books from an extended deal, or from a series that's extended, that company basically owns all television film rights for the entire world, the Malazan world. So it was 38 properties when we finally worked it all out. And that would have just really screwed us over. So we dodged a bullet. And now we're still marketing it, and we'll see what happens.
I think it could work extraordinarily well in some, like a video game like The Witcher, where you can just kind of go wild with it,
Yeah.
and then let the tiles fall where they will kind of afterwards. But before,
Well, my super ambitious plan, which will never happen because nobody has, well, the people who have the billions of dollars are not interested in this, but I wanted to do, television has stolen a lot from film, right? Visually, narratively, and of course the big screen has suffered because it's coming up against the competition of television. Television writing is actually superior now to film writing by far. What I wanted to do was basically turn each novel of the 10-book series into a trilogy of films, and to then release 10 films a year for 3 years. What do you think? Yeah, I mean, that would have been pretty cool. It would have been pretty cool, but nobody will do that, obviously.
Who's playing Whiskey Jack?
Sorry?
Who's playing Whiskey Jack?
I haven't a clue.
Jason Statham.
No, I don't. Sorry, I missed the name out there?
Jason Statham.
Jason who?
Jason
Oh,
Statham.
Statham. No.
So what we're going to do, just before we move on to you guys' questions, I want Stephen to pronounce some words for me. This is just for me.
And me.
And everybody, probably. Stephen, will you...
Okay, you know the audiobooks? Neither reader for the audiobooks, this is 2 for the series, ever contacted me regarding pronunciation. So they're all over the place.
Here we go.
Right, let's get it right.
Okay, how do you say this?
Kachin Chamal.
I think we all got that one. But we were all afraid, weren't we? We didn't want to say it out loud. What about this one?
Kachin Naruk.
No one's ever said that out loud.
I barely recognized it actually.
Okay, I think we all know how to do this, but let's get confirmation.
Talana Mass.
This one's bothered me for ages. Do that one for me.
Mibe.
I've been saying maybe for ages. Maybe she will. And last one, just do that one for me.
Ontos Falak.
Now you have it.
But no, you're missing a ton.
I'm missing a ton of them.
Tice and D.
Taste.
Tice and D.
I didn't want to touch it.
Tice the Dur.
I didn't want to touch it. I'm not messing. I thought I'd be the only one who didn't know.
Any others? Throw them out.
Throw them out.
I'm great with Jagger.
Jagut.
Krupp.
Which?
Darajista.
Krupp. Yeah, not Kruppe.
I'm the
Krupp.
crook for ages.
He was one of the characters in Cam was running the game, so I rolled up the character of Krupp.
Did you just speak crap the entire time?
Yeah, in the 3rd person. It was awesome.
I only sounded Darajistan after listening
Darujistan?
to the Darajistan, yeah.
Darujistan.
After listening to the books on the audio.
That's awful.
That's one I couldn't say for years.
Yeah.
Couldn't know.
Okay.
I'd say if somebody asked me what these books is about at this stage, like, where are they? I don't know.
Yeah.
Who's he? That's the level we're at now. I'm glad. Listen, when you all go home, he's coming home with me and he's just going to answer questions. That's the way it's going to be. Right, so what we're going to do is anybody who has questions, stick their hand up. That's probably like two people, really? 2?
I'll get
6? Okay, so what we'll do is I'm going to point at you. Okay, so you're in the corner. Let's go. You first.
Just out of curiosity, you said that most of the characters were played through games.
Mhm.
Just wondering if that was concurrently or sequentially, because I've been involved in games where the same characters inhabited the same timelines, but in both situations. So I'm just wondering, were you kind of taking 3 weeks playing one set, 3 weeks playing the other, and working
No,
forward through the
we
timeline that way?
alternated. We would alternate who ran the game that night.
Right.
And so, but sometimes we would play both sides. So, for example, in Darujistan, Cam came up with the city. He mapped the city and all the rest. And I was playing. Let's see, I was playing Krupp, Ralaknom. Crocus didn't exist. Crocus is for the novel only. So Krupp, Ralaknom, Murillo. And Cam's NPCs were Cole, Baruch, the alchemist, Vorkin, people like that. And then we blended the story because I was running the game where he had, maybe he was running, we ended up, let's think about this. Because what we did was we converged 3 campaigns. We were doing Whiskey Jack, Fiddler and Hedge, let's see, Fiddler and Hedge, Quick Ben, and Kalam. And we would actually split the squad. So some games he was running that campaign, at other times. And I think my characters were Quick Ben, Kalam, and Fiddler. And he had the other ones. And then my first character ever rolled up was Anamander Rake. And then we just blended him into the whole storyline. And we played out the fete at the end of Gardens of the Moon. That was actually gamed out. And but normally later on, we moved from sort of one-on-one gaming, which I know sounds strange, but where I had a whole group of people, and then I ran them through sequentially, or not sequentially. I ran them through in a linear fashion, the full timeline. The poor guy, I did a one-on-one game with a guy named Mark Paxton McRae, and he rolled up his character. He gave the name to me as Karsa Orlan, and then I sat down and put together a campaign for him. And the poor man, he had no idea what was coming. I said, okay, you're living in a tribe in the mountains, and a couple of your friends come up to you, and one of them says, all right, it's time to go down to the valley and kill children. And the thing was, Mark had no idea that I turned his character into Teblor, into a Toblikai. So children, of course, is just short adult people. But he didn't know he was a giant. So he went through this horrible existential crisis. So, what is happening here? So yeah, every now and then, yeah, you mess with the heads of people. I mean, if you're running a game, that's the most fun of all.
Okay, hands up for the next question. Lady in front.
Thank you. When I was reading, there was the concept of hot iron and cold iron for personalities. And I was wondering, did you invent it or did you take it from somewhere? Because I googled it and I couldn't find it anywhere. Like, nobody knows it unless they read the friggin' book.
Yeah.
I want to use it in conversations and I can't.
It does work. When you think about it. When I read it, I was like dividing all my friends into those categories.
Yeah, invented on the fly, actually. Yeah.
Wow.
Next up, you at the back there. That's you.
Yay. You said there about like creating the Karsa Orlan characters, and did you relish in the kind of moralistic dilemmas you see for characters?
And most of our gaming was just that, to actually create a moral quandary in the players and really mess with their heads. Yeah.
So when you wrote kind of like, you know, Whiskey Jack taking the fall for Amanda Rake with all the women in that scene.
No, that was fiction. That was not game.
Did you deliberately go in saying I want to make people feel a certain way, or did it just happen along the way and it was the most logical course?
There are fantasy writers out there who, when they kill characters in their books, leave you wondering whether they killed them for the purposes of boredom on their part, or the desire to create a new story. But for this writing and for the Malazan stuff, if I'm going to kill a major character, I want you to feel it. There has to be an emotional context to it. And then in order for that to be authentic, I have to feel it first. And if I don't, then I fail at my task.
Coltane.
Yes.
Hands up. Let's go right at the back and we'll work our way forward.
Sure.
Literally, you're at the door. I feel bad for you.
At the door. So a lot of authors will say that they have what ifs for what founds their series. Is there a Malazan what if? And if so, what is it?
For what defines the series?
Yeah, like, you know, what if this happened? Like, is there a what if for the Malazan series? And if so,
In terms of the world building and the story?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What if you could create a world and a civilization where sexism does not exist? And then, as anthropologists, we said, well, how can you get to that point? Well, fantasy is all about magic. So if magic is accessible to all on the basis of merit, discipline, study, and all the rest, you cannot have a gender-based hierarchy of power because it can never be maintained. And so it was a world without sexism. But then we couldn't signpost that because every character in that world doesn't think in those terms. So they wouldn't be, you know, saying, you know, speaking on behalf of patriarchy or whatever. It's all about access to power. And so that was kind of the big what ifs for the series. And oddly enough, I think it wasn't until somebody wrote a review by the third book, Memories of Ice, where they actually noticed. Because it's not present. It's significant by its absence. And that's why you have female characters running all the way through in all levels of power. Good question.
Thanks.
Second last at the back again. Yeah.
Hello. I know you haven't read them, but which one is your favourite book in the series?
Okay.
And why?
I guess I would define that 3 ways. To me, the most satisfying to write the books was Dead House Gates. Because, bear in mind, it took me 8 years to find a publisher for Gardens of the Moon. So everything was held in check. And, that 8 years was not me constantly flogging the manuscript. It went out once, it stayed with a publisher in the States for 2 years before it showed up in the mail. And this is long before electronic stuff, so it's the actual copy shows up in the mail. And then 18 months at another US publisher, at which point I shelved it. I just put it away. So then I ended up living in the UK, and I sell Gardens of the Moon. And it was like, here I had this editor just coming out of nowhere who had faith in what I was doing. And it just sort of unleashed me at that point. So I was working at Toyota head office in Red Hill in Surrey. And I had a Scion MX-5. Do you guys know what that is?
Yes.
Yeah? It was a little word processor, a little monochrome word processor. Not much bigger than this. And I wrote Dead House Gates on it. And I wrote it in my lunch breaks. And then when I came home from work, I lived in Dorking, and I stopped off at Café Rouge, and I would write for a couple of hours, and then end up heading home. And it felt complete as a book. It did everything I wanted it to do. And I would write the music, and quite often the main soundtrack was Black Hawk Down, because you can do that whole final scene from the wall of Erin. Everything in that can be done in silence to leave no man behind in Black Hawk Down. And I used to play that while I was writing it. So it just ran through my head. This is a symphonic piece. So that's one of them. Midnight Tides wrote itself. It just came out. I invented a hole on the roof that he was standing on. And then I thought, well, maybe I should describe what he's wearing. And I thought, he's not wearing anything. He's wearing a blanket. And he just sort of came out from nowhere. So that was the most effortless writing. But for me, the greatest impact for me in the series is Toll the Hounds. And that was, my father was dying at the time, so the entire novel is a delving into the nature of grief and working through that grief. And also, it's the cipher for the series, because the point of view, the voice, this is the first, or the only one of the entire 10-book series where you know the voice that's driving the narrative is Krupp. And so he's a kind of self-conscious narrator, so it's metafictional. And that is actually the cipher to an alternate reading of the entire series as being metafictional. So Toll the Hounds, I think, is probably the one that stands out the most for me.
Put your hands up.
Oh, more questions now.
More. Everybody's getting brave now.
Reading.
We're all getting brave. Okay, let's go right beside the bar with the blue arm. That's you.
He's napping.
That's you. He's napping. Yeah.
Clearly napping. As an author, you have never shied away from using a fantasy world to comment on contemporary issues like colonialism or capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have published a prologue for The God Is Not Willing already, and it feels like it's going to touch on another contemporary issue, which is like climate change. And
Mm-hmm.
is this something you're going to pursue further? And is this something you want to explore in your writing?
I don't think I'm going to go very heavily into climate change as a human-generated event. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind it is, and we've been changing the climate since the Neolithic. But I don't know how I would answer that. I mean, every novel is a dialogue with the world around, the real world, during the time it was written. But the style I'm approaching with the Carson trilogy is much closer to Gardens of the Moon than it is to the later books of the series. So it rips along fairly fast. So I guess that's an answer to your question. Yeah.
Hands up. Right, we're moving forward now. Glasses, blondie hair. That's you.
What is your process for constructing these big, intricate plots in your novels?
Weed.
Yeah. No, are you kidding? No, I stopped that pretty early on. I mean, I left it behind in my archaeology days.
Points.
Yeah. I mean, the brain gets too lazy. You just can't do it. So I had certain scenes in that I knew were going to show up in The Crippled God. And they were some fairly major ones. And then it was simply a question of writing my way to get there, but to not rush myself, to be very patient about it, and to build, because those scenes only work if you carry the emotional impact of the previous 9 books. One of them is characterized by adjective or wordlessly making a sound, a scream, basically. And that only means anything if you've read and understood what she's gone through to get there. Do you see what I mean? So I needed to really be careful in my preparations to get up to those scenes, to the payoffs. And so I would be foreshadowing through all 10 books. It was a great, it turned out by accident, but I think, yeah, probably even with Gardens of the Moon, my editor was a wonderful guy, stayed with me through the entire series here in the UK. Tor, I get a different editor every month. I don't know what's going on there. But Bantam UK has been brilliant, and Simon Taylor stayed with me. And he would do his edit, and the manuscript would come back to me. He'd say, well, you know, it's a little bit long along this area. Can we cut this out, maybe this, and make it a bit leaner? And I'd write back saying, well, actually, what happens in those 2 paragraphs comes back in book 7 or book 9. So I can't cut it out. And finally, he gave up. And so it worked. It was brilliant. And but the thing was, I wasn't lying. You know, it's all built that way. It's built to slowly add resonance to every event that's occurring until you get to, where are you, halfway through Crippled God?
I'm probably the least experienced person right here. I started Crippled God about a week ago. So I'm hoping not. You can ruin it. It doesn't matter.
No, you have no idea what's coming. No.
Yeah, I personally, I started reading these books about a year ago, and it's been everything I've done in every waking moment that hasn't involved my actual life has been glued to these books, and hence my first question being, what's wrong with him? Because I don't know what's going on anymore. My whole life is wrong. And I began Crippled God maybe 4 days ago, and I think I'm maybe a quarter way through, maybe. Wow. And yeah, I'm burning. My girlfriend doesn't even know what my name is anymore. The dogs don't talk to me, nothing happens. There's no bills getting paid. So I've just been doing this, and I'm committed. The next 2 years is just going through all this stuff, every side book, and then starting again.
How many people have finished the series here? Is there anybody who hasn't? Sorry?
5 times.
5 times.
I'm following you from the beginning.
Right. Okay, so were there people who haven't finished the series? You got a few hands?
I just bought the remaining 5 books because I was waiting for them to finish. Okay. So.
Close your ears, folks.
No spoilers.
Yeah, let's keep it civil. Relax.
Yeah.
Fights outside afterwards.
Who here is familiar with Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey? Okay. Well, a lot of novels basically try to emulate that. They create a character who undertakes the hero's journey. I did not want to do that. What I wanted to do was have characters undertake parts of the hero's journey, and some would complete those parts, others would fail at those parts. I wanted the hero's journey to be the readers. So to get from book 1 to book 10 is the hero's journey.
Absolute stress.
Hands up.
Full of pleasure.
Okay, giant lad. Yeah, that's you. Yeah, there's no one behind you, man.
You know what? You know what? You look like Joe Abercrombie. Did you know that? So what the hell are you doing here?
Let's have you, then we're going to move it forward, alright?
Who is, the Malazan series, hands down, the most powerful character?
Who was the most powerful character in the entire series?
Crap. Yeah, no doubt about it. Yeah.
And the funniest.
Yeah.
Sticky donuts.
Hands up again. Okay, this chap here, beard. That's you. Yeah, I know half of us. I know. It's just the way it's going to work out. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. I was wondering, you played as a player and as a GM for many campaigns over long periods of time. How do you keep the campaigns going and keep players actually showing up and actually able to show up on such a long-term and ambitious?
Man, find better friends. Really? Of course they should show up.
If the microphone wasn't attached, he would have dropped it. Hands up. We'll get over to you. We'll get to you in a second. That's you, chap.
How closely do you and Cam work together on the books? Because there's not many, but a couple discrepancy I found between yours and his.
Oh, no doubt. We hardly work together at all. We meet up once a year, usually once a year, at a conference in Orlando called International Conference on the Fantastic in the Arts. It's more of an academic conference. We go there, hang out by the pool, and get drunk and talk about what we're working on. And so we work through some stories there, and then he goes back and does what he does. And often I don't see the manuscript until the book's been published.
Okay, so sorry, that was Orlando, and that was where?
We want to have a word with them, do you?
More than one.
Right. Yeah. Hands up. Okay, let's go to you. Yeah.
So, you started from RPGs, and lots of them leave magic, how it feels vague. Do you have an idea of how it would feel to like open a warren, or is it like only describable as a metaphor?
I'm glad you used the word metaphor. A lot of writers of fantasy, they end up creating a magic system that is basically a replacement for technology. So they've got all the rules. All the rules are laid out. And once you do that, you've lost the purpose of magic in fantasy. Because the original purpose of magic in fantasy is to invoke a sense of wonder and mystery. And so once you've explained it all, you've lost it. So we made a point of never explaining the magic, as you may have noticed.
Hands up. I'll get to you guys last, right? You guys are going to be the last group here. You don't want to stop. Put your hand down. Greedy. You. Yeah.
I just wondering about. So how did you make the transition between studying archaeology and anthropology and working in the field to becoming an author and becoming a full-time author then after?
Well, field work is summer. You get paid to work in on a dig during the summer. And so I continued doing that even when I was taking the writing program at the University of Victoria. So the winters I would do, I'd learned how to basically be a short story writer. That's what I learned. I've never learned to be a novelist, and I still don't know how to be a novelist. So in many ways, this is the world's longest short story. No, I'm not kidding, because you write it differently. You write a short story very differently from how you write a novel. In a novel, you can luxuriate, you can wander around. Short stories, every sentence has to have at least 2 levels of meaning. And as you have all discovered, especially with rereads, you see that that's how it works. And I know there's a group of people doing a podcast that have just finished discussing Gardens of the Moon. One of them has read it before, but the other 2 are new. And of those 2 new people, one of them has, as her only experience in fantasy, reading Hunger Games. And when I heard that, I thought, you poor baby. And even worse, she used the audiobook. for Gardens in the Moon. So she was utterly lost and hated the novel from start to finish. And I'm not surprised, because sometimes you got to go back on a few lines. You actually got to go back and think what's being said here. And because I learned within universities, the push there is for he said, she said. So you show, you don't tell, right? You don't dump the exposition all over the place. So in many ways, it may seem like a dense writing style, but it's actually a very terse style. I don't give you a lot. And so it's up to you to work that stuff out. So, yeah, anyways, it's, that transition was fairly straightforward. It took a long time for me to actually become a full-time writer. I guess I've been full-time for about 19 years now.
Hands up. Yourself there.
Hello. So whenever you decided to write Midnight Tides, do you feel there was risk involved? Because it was a completely new continent. The only character that we knew was Troll Sungar.
Yeah.
And so whenever it came to you, it was your producers going, "Whoa, Stephen, what are you doing here?"
Yeah, and I would tell them this is the third point of the triangle. So this is the last new place and new characters we're going to be and then the entire series ultimately converges on that spot. Yeah, it was a bit of a risk. I knew that. But then they were all in, right? They were screwed. They couldn't back out.
Too late. Hand up. Yourself there at the back.
Yeah.
That's you.
All right. I wanted to ask you.
Taxi man, we waited on you outside.
We did. We've been all waiting on you.
The reason you sat here for 5 minutes is this chap got lost in the cab, and we waited for him outside. Hang on, before you begin, he made it. He made it. Let's go.
What interests me is your state of attention while writing. While you talked about being a writer, when I read your books, and I read them 5 times, I touched a kind of magic that is not in the words, but in the state of attention that you had while writing.
Intention?
Attention.
Attention.
That's something you were, the way I experienced it and the way I read them, I went into a kind of trance state. And this is why those people are here, because they were not just by technique or by words, but by a sense of magic that was touching their personal life. For me, this is one question. And the second is, I was a soldier, a medic, and a healer in my life. And you wrote about those roles as if you really were there. And I know you were not in war while I was. And I wondered, from where did you get this intimate personal knowledge of war, of healing? That's the question.
Okay. So, 2 questions, basically, yes?
Yeah.
All right, the first one, attention. Remember I mentioned that Toll the Hounds is the cipher. And when I mentioned the fact that this series is metafictional, do people understand what I'm saying there? Right? Metafictional is a kind of self-conscious storytelling. So it's when you fall into a fiction, you're reading a book, you kind of do a mental shift where you're flowing into that world, and it's as if you're reading a history book or something along those lines. So in other words, what is reported to you is what is real, and what is reported to you is always authentic, is always honest, is always factual. But of course, the structure of short storytelling is actually the opposite of that. Everything is done with intention to create an emotional effect. And so the entire 10-book series is actually the voice of a storyteller who is writing and giving you only those details that that storyteller deems necessary to bring you to an emotional point. And so it is this making sense?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's that's why it's metafictional. That's why Krupp is actually Stephen Erikson at the same time, right? I'm creating for an emotional effect. And and of course, the whole process involves me actually experiencing those emotional effects before you guys do. So I'm accompanying you on that journey, but I do it from the creative standpoint before anybody gets to see it. So I have to take it on faith that I have readers out there who will follow me. So that's the first one. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. The second one, I worked in Central America, in Belize, on an archaeology dig back in 1983. And when the dig wrapped up, I'll backtrack a little bit. When you're on a dig, especially in Canada, especially at that time, you end up in a fairly isolated environment. Generally, you're in tents. There's 9 or 10 of you, and you're out in the bush. And eventually, or very quickly actually, the civilized veneer of people's behavior just falls away, and you get to find out who they really are. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's Jack of the Shining, and I'm not kidding. My direction when I got in Canada, you call it bush fever. When I get bushed, I get more comical, but a lot of people go the opposite way. And so I did have a coworker attack me with a hatchet once, so, because I said the wrong thing at the wrong time. So that kind of experience on digs really informed the squads of the bridge burners. So that's one side of things. But anyways, back to Central America in '83. After the dig, I headed down to Honduras, discovered that it was a funnel for gun running into Nicaragua. And so I ended up in Nicaragua and then in Guatemala. I'm not going to tell a lot of that story. Guatemala was in the middle of a civil war at the time. And you had a massive population movement all through the Petén, heading up into Mexico. The aristocracy, if you will, the Latino aristocracy in Guatemala, were driving the native people off the mountainsides using the army. Basically, any Guatemalan coffee you drink now is black coffee. It was just horrendous what was going on. So entirely by accident, I found myself in the midst of all that. And I actually spent 3 days tracking my way through the jungle, trying to get back to Belize, dodging military vehicles. And it all started with me on a tarmac on an airstrip in the jungle in the Petén with an M16 to the back of my head. So, but I eventually made it through. But I did experience, I sort of wandered like a ghost through a fairly war-ravaged place. And I know a lot of that has stayed with me. And so when I'm writing, oh, cheers, man.
Delicious points.
So when I'm writing this stuff, I try to sort of circle my way back to the emotions I was experiencing there. The worst day was in a crossroads outside a village that had been abandoned. And there were 3 cane cutters had been executed against a pig wall right beside me. And I was waiting for a cane truck or something to come by to get a ride. And there was a goat crying in the village endlessly. So finally I wandered into the village, and I did find the goat. It was in a pen in the backyard of a very, very poor ramshackle hut. And fire ants had found it. And because it was tied to a stake, it couldn't run away. So they were in the eyes, the nose, the ears, up the anus, all the rest. And it's the only animal I've ever killed. I found a broken machete and I killed it. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, you spend a whole afternoon with three corpses. It's a pretty strange experience. So I made it back to Belize and went out to the Keys and bought an ounce of sensibilia, and I just melted down for about 10 days. But you know, I get letters from veterans all the time, especially ones who are recovering from severe injuries.
I recommend your books to people
Do you?
with PTSD because they show a way out of it.
And I get, you just sent a chill through me because I get about a dozen of those a year. Yeah.
you.
Hands up. Let's go over here.
So when are we going to get a trilogy about the adventures of T. Hall and his chicken?
The Hole in the Chicken? Ask Terry Goodkin. I'm just kidding. No, I don't think there'll be an adventures for them. No, they've done their part. He's king to Hole, the only. Yeah.
Job done.
Job done.
Hands up. Back.
Just following back to what I started with, which was the gaming, because now you have me curious exactly what point in the books do you get past the material that you were elaborating on from campaigns and into wholly new creation?
A lot of it is new creation. A lot of what are gaming built the background history. That's why Cam is now writing The Origins of Empire with Caliban and Dancer. That is what we gained. And so, if you think about it, Gardens of the Moon starts after all of that.
Okay. And secondly, would you consider taking the suggestion of not doing foreign dates anymore as?
I still volunteer. I've worked for a few years in southern Italy, in Puglia, on a very interesting site. And but I did realize after Mongolia that I was getting too old for this crap. And so I try to be more civilized in my approach now. So these are well-run digs. They're not run by flaming idiots like they were in Russia, in Mongolia.
Right, just as we get to the end of this before we go on to sign, and anybody else? Right, it's yourself.
Which of the supporting characters has stuck with you all these years? So
Which of
your supporting character, like the
supporting?
minor characters, like, for
Minor
example, as in like the certain Marines, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Like giving like Vastly Blank, for example.
Vastly Blank, yeah. Which has stayed with me. No, I think I was fairly content with their fates. I'm not going to give away too much because of this generally is not.
It's all my fault.
But the only thing I can promise is some time in the Karsa trilogy you will meet some of the regulars who were there in the Crypt of God. And I have revealed earlier today in the Coffee Clatch, somebody said that one of my favorite characters was Spindle. Was that you?
Yeah.
And I said, well, you're in luck, because he's probably the only bridge burner who is going to be in the Karsa.
Anyway, folks, thank you very much to Stephen. You're sticking around, it's not all over. It's not all over. Stephen's going to sign whatever you brought with you. And then when we're done, we're going to go upstairs, we're going to drink more pints.
I'm not signing anything.
He's done. He's done. I have to tell people, when I first asked Stephen, I'd seen he was over for Worldcon, I said, do you want to get together with some of your fans and do some signings and some Q&As? He said, yeah, absolutely. And I said, do you need anything? And he said, Guinness. That was literally it. Yeah. So, everybody, thank you very much to Stephen. If everybody wants to get together, get your stuff together, we're going to create a space here, form a line, and Stephen's going to sign all your books and your arses.